Indiana, February 1993. Linda Iseler's husband Richard Hoagland vanished after saying he needed emergency medical care. Nobody was ever found. For over 2 decades, she raised their 2 young sons alone, living with the haunting uncertainty of his fate. Then, one summer afternoon in 2016, her phone rang. Detective Anthony Cardillo delivered 7 words that shattered her reality. "We have Richard Hoagland in custody." Her husband wasn't dead. He had been living under a stolen identity in Florida with a new family, just miles from where she had spent years grieving a ghost. This is the story of a man who chose to disappear, and the family left behind to pick up the shattered pieces. Chapter 1. The Vanishing. February 1993 brought the kind of cold that settled into Indiana's bones and refused to leave. The sky hung gray and heavy over neighborhoods where families went about their ordinary lives, unaware that some routines would never return to normal. Linda Iseler was at work when her phone rang that afternoon, her husband's voice coming through with an urgency that made her straighten in her chair. Richard needed to go to the emergency room immediately. He was ill, he explained, and couldn't wait. Linda offered to leave work right away, to meet him there, or drive him herself. But Richard insisted there was no time to wait. He would go alone. She heard the tension in his voice, but trusted his judgment. After 11 years of marriage, she had learned to recognize when her husband made decisions that couldn't be argued. That was the last conversation Linda Iseler would have with her husband for 23 years. When she arrived home that evening, the house felt wrong before she could identify why. Their 2 sons, ages 6 and 9, asked where Daddy was. Linda called every hospital within driving distance. Her voice grew more desperate with each receptionist who checked records and found nothing. Richard Hoagland had been admitted. No one matching his description had come through emergency rooms across the county. She walked through their home, searching for clues her mind couldn't yet accept. His toothbrush sat in the holder by the sink. No clothes were missing from drawers or closets. His winter coat still hung by the door, and February in Indiana demanded a coat. Everything suggested he had stepped out briefly and would return momentarily. But the hours crawled past midnight, and Richard never came home. Days transformed into weeks, while Linda existed in a strange suspension between hope and horror. Police opened a missing person investigation. Detectives asked questions that felt like accusations. They searched the house, interviewed neighbors, and constructed timelines. Richard Hoagland had simply evaporated, leaving no trace, no body, no evidence of foul play or voluntary departure. The whispers started in grocery store aisles and church parking lots. Neighbors who once smiled warmly now watched Linda with calculating eyes. The unspoken question hung in every conversation. What did she do to him? Police suspicions circled back repeatedly, their questions growing sharper. Linda found herself defending her innocence in her own tragedy, proving she hadn't murdered a man who might not even be dead. Financial devastation followed emotional destruction. Without Richard's income and with no death certificate to claim life insurance or benefits, Linda watched their stability crumble. The house went first, then the cars. She moved with her bewildered sons into smaller spaces, taking extra work shifts, stretching every dollar until it screamed. The boys asked questions she couldn't answer. Where was Dad? When was he coming back? Was he in heaven? Linda told police what Richard had mentioned months earlier, during what she now recognized as perhaps a warning. He claimed he was wanted by the FBI for embezzling millions of dollars. He said he might have to leave town. At the time, she hadn't believed such an outlandish story. Now, detectives investigated this lead, while Linda wondered if anything she knew about her husband was true. Grief without closure became a weight she carried through every moment. She couldn't mourn properly because he might be alive. She couldn't move forward because he might return. The legal system offered no category for her existence, stuck between widow and wife, living in a perpetual state of unresolved loss. Her sons grew older in the shadow of their father's absence, learning to navigate a world where other children had fathers at baseball games and school events. Linda learned to introduce herself without the complicated explanation, to attend parent-teacher conferences alone, to become both mother and father to boys who deserved better than abandonment, disguised as mystery. Chapter 2. The Dead Man's Name. Florida, 1991. Terry Jude Szymanski was a fisherman who made his living from the sea, a man whose hands knew the weight of nets and the smell of salt air. When he died that year, his death was recorded with the usual bureaucratic efficiency. A certificate was filed, records were updated, and eventually his name became just another entry in the vast database of the deceased. What no one anticipated was that his death certificate would become the blueprint for another man's resurrection. Somewhere between the cold February of his disappearance and the humid Florida summers that followed, Richard Hoagland acquired that precious document. The details of how remain unclear, lost in the shadows between legal records and criminal ingenuity. What matters is that he held in his hands the key to a new existence, a dead man's identity waiting to be worn like a suit tailored for deception. Richard didn't simply use Szymanski's name. He became him. He memorized dates and details, constructed a history from the fragments of a fisherman's life, and presented himself to Florida with the confidence of someone who had nothing to hide. He obtained a social security number that belonged to a corpse. He built credit in the name of a man whose body had long since been buried. The bureaucratic systems designed to protect identity proved surprisingly easy to manipulate when armed with the right paperwork and sufficient audacity. In Pasco County, Richard established himself as Terry Szymanski with methodical precision. He found work, signed leases, and opened bank accounts. Each transaction added another layer of legitimacy to his fabricated existence. Neighbors knew him as Terry, a friendly enough man who kept to himself but seemed perfectly ordinary. He met a woman who knew nothing of Indiana winters or abandoned families. She fell in love with Terry Szymanski, unaware she was building a life with a ghost wearing a stolen face. Richard married again under his dead man's name. Children were born into this manufactured reality, carrying the genes of Richard Hoagland, but the name and supposed heritage of Terry Szymanski. Family photos showed birthdays and holidays, a man who appeared to be living an unremarkable suburban life. He attended barbecues and neighborhood gatherings. He paid taxes and renewed his driver's license. The performance was so complete that even those closest to him never suspected the elaborate lie that formed the foundation of their relationship. Meanwhile, 700 miles north, Linda navigated a completely different reality. She marked anniversaries of the disappearance with the kind of quiet devastation that becomes routine. February arrived each year like a punishment, the calendar forcing her to relive that phone call, that empty house, that moment when ordinary life shattered. Her sons grew through the milestones Richard missed. The first days of school became routine without him. Birthday candles were blown out in his absence. The Tooth Fairy, Santa Claus, graduation caps, and gowns all happened in a world where their father had simply evaporated. Linda learned to answer the inevitable questions at parent-teacher conferences and doctor's appointments. The story became practiced, smoothed by repetition into something she could deliver without breaking. She explained to concerned teachers why the emergency contact forms listed only her name. She sat alone at school plays and band concerts, watching her sons scan the audience for a father who would never appear. The other mothers stopped asking after a while, their pity morphing into uncomfortable silence. As years accumulated, Linda gradually accepted what seemed like the only logical conclusion. Richard must be dead. No one disappears this completely unless death has claimed them. She grieved for a man she would never bury, mourned a marriage that ended without divorce papers, and raised sons who would grow into men without their father's guidance. She learned to introduce herself without the complicated backstory, to exist as simply Linda rather than the woman whose husband vanished without explanation. 23 years passed this way. Two parallel existences, one built on truth and struggle, the other constructed from fraud and selfishness. In Florida, Richard Hoagland lived comfortably as Terry Szymanski, his past buried as thoroughly as the real fisherman whose name he had stolen. In Indiana, Linda built a life from the wreckage, never knowing that the man she grieved was alive and well, living under a dead man's identity, having chosen his own comfort over the family he left behind to suffer. Chapter 3. The Call That Changes Everything. Summer 2016 arrived with the kind of oppressive heat that makes even simple tasks feel exhausting. Linda had long since stopped marking the years since Richard's disappearance with the same sharp grief that once defined them. 23 years had transformed the acute pain into something duller, a permanent ache she had learned to carry. Her sons were men now, building their own lives, and Linda had constructed a version of peace from the ruins of that February day in 1993. Her phone rang on ordinary afternoon, the kind of call she had answered thousands of times without consequence. The voice on the other end identified himself as Detective Anthony Cardillo from the Pasco County Sheriff's Department in Florida. He asked if she knew who Richard Hoagland was. The question seemed absurd. Of course, she knew. That was her husband. Her ex-husband, technically, though the dissolution of their marriage had happened through absence rather than legal proceedings. She confirmed the relationship, her mind already racing through possibilities, none of them approaching the truth she was about to hear. Detective Cardillo delivered his news with professional directness. They had Richard Hoagland in custody. Those 7 words rearranged Linda's entire understanding of the past 2 decades. Her husband wasn't dead. He hadn't been kidnapped or murdered or lost to some tragic accident. He had been alive this entire time, living deliberately, breathing and moving through the world while she grieved a ghost. The room seemed to tilt around her. 23 years of carefully constructed acceptance collapsed in seconds. Every holiday she had endured alone, every milestone she had witnessed without him, every night she had cried herself to sleep, wondering what had happened, suddenly transformed from tragedy into betrayal. The detective continued explaining the circumstances of Richard's arrest, but Linda struggled to process words through the roaring in her ears. Authorities had discovered the fraud through a combination of suspicious paperwork and vigilant investigators. Someone had noticed inconsistencies in the identity of the man calling himself Terry Szymanski. Small discrepancies that might have been overlooked individually accumulated into a pattern that demanded investigation. When detectives began pulling threads, the entire fabricated identity unraveled with surprising speed. The real Terry Szymanski had been dead for years. The man using his name and social security number was very much alive, living in Pasco County with a family who believed every lie he told them. Linda's sons, now adults with their own complicated feelings about the father who abandoned them, made arrangements to travel to Florida. The drive felt surreal, each mile bringing them closer to a confrontation 23 years in the making. They were heading to see their father, a man they had mourned as children and learned to live without as they grew into men. The boy who had been 6 years old when his father disappeared was now 29. The 9-year-old was 32. They had built entire adult lives in Richard's absence. The reunion carried none of the warmth such moments are supposed to hold. Richard stood before them as both stranger and father, his face aged by the same years that had transformed his children. Detective Cardillo later described the scene as something caught between anger and sadness, the emotional cocktail of people trying to process the incomprehensible. The sons looked at their father and saw someone who shared their blood, but not their history. This man had chosen to erase them from his life as thoroughly as if they had never existed. Richard's explanation, when it finally came, proved almost insulting in its simplicity. Family issues with his wife and children. That was it. No elaborate conspiracy, no witness protection, no federal investigation or life-threatening danger. Just a man who found his family inconvenient and decided to trade them for a fresh start. He had looked at his wife and 2 young sons and concluded that walking away was easier than staying. The enormity of such casual cruelty left everyone struggling for adequate words. Linda learned that Richard's new family in Florida had lived in fear once they discovered the truth. They worried he might harm them to protect his secret. They had waited 3 years before finally contacting authorities, their silence born from terror. Detective Cardillo spoke of relationships shattered, of the 20 years of marriage between Richard and Linda obliterated by sustained deception. The emotions cycling through everyone involved range from fury to bewilderment, circling always around that eternal question that Richard could never adequately answer. Why? Chapter 4. The Reckoning. July 2016 brought Richard Hoagland before the American justice system on charges of fraudulent use of personal identification. The evidence against him was overwhelming and irrefutable. For over 2 decades, he had lived under a stolen identity, using a dead man's name to construct an entirely fabricated existence. Yet when asked to enter his plea, Richard Hoagland stood in that Florida courtroom and declared himself not guilty. The audacity of the claim seemed almost fitting for a man who had spent 23 years maintaining one of the most elaborate lies imaginable. The family in Florida who had known him as Terry Szymanski faced their own reckoning. The woman who had married him, who had built a life and raised children with him, discovered that her entire relationship was founded on fiction. Every anniversary they celebrated, every family photo they took, every moment of supposed intimacy had been shared with a man who was lying about his most basic identity. Their children learned that the name they carried, the family history they believed in, and the father they thought they knew were all constructions built on theft and deception. What emerged during the investigation proved even more disturbing. Richard's Florida family had discovered the truth about his identity 3 years before they finally contacted authorities. For 36 months, they lived with the knowledge that the man in their home was not who he claimed to be. They remained silent because they feared him. Once his carefully maintained facade cracked, they worried about what he might do to protect his secrets. The fear was substantial enough that they waited years before daring to bring law enforcement into the situation. They had lived with a stranger who wore their loved one's face, uncertain whether confrontation would trigger violence. Linda found herself processing a grief that had transformed into something far more complicated. For 23 years, she had mourned a man she believed was dead. She had worked through the stages of loss, had built a life around his absence, and had learned to exist in a world where Richard no longer breathed. Now she had to dismantle all that carefully constructed acceptance and rebuild her understanding around a far more painful truth. Richard hadn't died. He had chosen to leave. He had looked at his wife and young sons and decided they were obstacles rather than treasures. The weight of that deliberate abandonment proved heavier than grief had ever been. Her sons, now men in their 30s, grappled with their own version of this twisted revelation. They had been 6 and 9 years old when their father walked out of their lives. They had grown up answering questions about why their dad never came to school events, why family photos showed only their mother, and why they seemed different from other children whose fathers came home each evening. They had processed his absence as a tragedy, something beyond anyone's control, learning that he had chosen to abandon them, that he had built another family while they struggled, added layers of betrayal that no amount of time could adequately address. Detective Cardillo's assessment captured the complexity perfectly. The marriage between Richard and Linda, once built on love and shared dreams, had been utterly shattered by sustained deception. The emotional landscape his actions created defied simple categorization. Anger competed with sadness. Confusion wrestled with clarity. The sons looked at their father and recognized biology, but felt no connection to the stranger who wore a familiar face. The real Terry Szymanski's family learned that their loved one's identity had been stolen and worn by a con artist for over 2 decades. Even in death, the fisherman had been robbed, his name and social security number used to facilitate another man's elaborate escape from responsibility. They had to process the violation of knowing their deceased relative had been exploited by someone with no connection to him beyond calculated theft. Linda's journey from assumed widow to betrayed wife offered no clear roadmap. Society understands how to support someone whose spouse has died. Casseroles arrive, condolences are offered, and grief is acknowledged as natural and expected. But there exists no established protocol for supporting someone whose dead spouse returns as a stranger who chose abandonment over family. Linda had to invent her own path through this unprecedented emotional territory. The questions that haunted everyone involved always circled back to the same fundamental mystery. Why? Why choose elaborate deception over simple divorce? Why steal another man's identity rather than building a new life honestly? Why inflict decades of suffering on people who loved him when he could have simply walked away with honesty? Richard's explanations never satisfied because no adequate explanation existed for such calculated cruelty disguised as disappearance. Some disappearances leave families searching for answers, but Linda's story proves that sometimes the truth is darker than any mystery. If this story left you stunned, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what shocked you most. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next story. Richard Hoagland's case represents one of the most calculated acts of familial abandonment in modern American history. He didn't just leave his family. He erased them completely, constructing an entirely new existence built on the stolen identity of a dead fisherman. While he lived comfortably in Florida sunshine with a new family who believed his lies, Linda and her sons survived decades of uncertainty, financial ruin, and a grief that had no resolution. The psychological toll of such betrayal extends far beyond what any court sentence could address. Linda spent 23 years mourning a ghost, raising 2 boys alone while facing whispers and suspicion from her own community. Those sons grew into men carrying the weight of abandonment, forever changed by a father who looked at them and decided they simply weren't worth staying for. No amount of explanation could justify such cruelty. What makes this case particularly disturbing is its simplicity. Richard didn't face some elaborate conspiracy or witness protection scenario. He wasn't fleeing danger or protecting his family from threats. He simply decided one February morning that his responsibilities were inconvenient, and he had the audacity to steal another man's entire identity to facilitate his escape. The real Terry Szymanski, even in death, became another victim of Richard's selfishness. This story serves as a stark reminder that sometimes the most devastating mysteries have the most mundane answers. Evil doesn't always arrive with dramatic motives. Sometimes it's just a man choosing comfort over character, deciding that starting over is easier than facing the life he built. If this story of betrayal and survival left you stunned, hit that subscribe button to hear more true cases that reveal the darkest sides of human nature. Drop a comment telling me what shocked you most about Richard's actions, or share your thoughts on how Linda and her sons found the strength to face him after all those years. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next story where we dive into another case that proves truth really is stranger than fiction.